Could the Sacramento Kings and Indiana Pacers be a good fit for each other for a draft night trade? Matt George from Locked On Kings and I break it all down on why it might make sense for the Pacers to move up, why it might make sense for the Kings to move down, and what the price of such a deal could look like for both teams. We'll break it all down today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers as always. My name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News. And today we're talking again about draft night trades, and specifically one with the Sacramento Kings. Why the Kings? Well, if you heard me talk about this around the lottery, I mentioned on this podcast that a team jumping up in the lottery that would like to win now could be good for the Pacers in that there would be a team willing to move back should the Pacers want to move up. Lo and behold, the Kings might be one of those teams that would like to win now, as they have not made the playoffs in 16 years. They have a GM in the last year of his contract. You could go on and on. So today, Matt George from Locked On Kings and I will parse through all of the factors at play for a potential Pacers-Kings draft night trade, what it could look like. Could Malcolm Brogdon be involved? Why the Pacers and Kings might both want to do this. We'll cover it from all angles, and we finally settle on sort of what the price would look like, at least to us, for the Pacers to move up in this draft. So without further ado, we'll bring in Matt George. I would like to thank everybody for listening to Locked On Pacers, making it your first listen every day. Reminder, we are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, where you can see both me and Matt's beautiful faces. And now, let's talk Pacers, Kings, and trading up.
Will the Kings move up? Will the Kings move down? Can the Indiana Pacers move up? So many questions, still so much time before the draft itself. And this is the time for speculation and the fun, one of my favorite parts of this time of year. And here we are, the Sacramento Kings, Indiana Pacers, after pulling off a big, someone call it blockbuster trade at the trade deadline. Suddenly, we're in trade conversations again, Tony East. Will the Kings and Pacers find a way to be draft night trade partners? Would the Sacramento Kings consider moving down to 6? What would they need from the Pacers in order to move down to 6? What would the Pacers do with number 4? We're going to try and answer as many of these questions as we possibly can. Welcome back, Tony. Has your fan base turned on you and turned on the trade yet? Are they still in love with Tyrese Halliburton and what everything's going on over there? Because Kings fans still miss Tyrese Halliburton big time, but are excited about Domantas Sabonis.
Yeah, Pacers fans are excited about the trade still. Halliburton looks like he could be maybe the best point guard the franchise has had in like 2 decades already. And he's only played 26 games for the team. And Buddy Hield decided to remember how to pass and defend a little bit in Indiana. So, yeah, Pacers fans are pretty happy with this trade. And I think they'd be happy if Kevin Pritchard and Monty McNair continued to call each other as this draft process heats up.
It would not shock me, as much as we know that this is kind of a fun, like, fantasy hypothetical element to this. It would not surprise me at all if there are phone calls happening between the Kings and the Pacers again. Like, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. There could be players that the Kings are willing to take in that 6 range that make more of a fit sense than a best player available sense. The Kings were expecting to be in that 7 range and got lucky moving up to 4 in the draft lottery. And we know when the Kings have moved up in the past, it hasn't quite gone too well. But it's all about, from a Sacramento perspective, Tony, what the Kings could get in addition to the 6th pick in order to be willing to move down 2 spots, because a lot can change, a lot can happen in 2 spots. Also, what happens in the top 3 really affects this decision. But I think for this exercise, we should assume that the hypothetical consensus top 3 of Paulo, Chet, Jabari, whatever order, those 3 are off the board. Basically, the Kings have the opportunity of Jaden Ivey right in their lap, or they could maybe take a flyer on a Shaedon Sharpe or Keegan Murray, or they consider trading back. I'll ask you first. What in that scenario you think makes the Pacers not necessarily desperate, but hungry or willing and actively trying to move up to 4?
Yeah, when I did my draft lottery preview, Matt, I said, I think something the Pacers would like if they don't move up is someone who's really trying to win this coming season to move up. The Blazers, the Kings, something. And then the Kings did, because now if the Pacers do want to move up, there is a team that in theory could be a trade partner for the Pacers who, despite being terrible last year, do have vets that could in theory facilitate something like this happening. So to your question, would the Pacers want to get involved? They don't pick high very often. It's their first single-digit pick since the 1980s, right? So to me, if you have this opportunity, getting the absolute best player you think you can reasonably obtain makes a lot of sense to them. And if they view it as, it seems like a lot of the experts have pegged this draft as the top 3 that you just mentioned, and then sort of Jaden Ivey's usually 4, and then another tier behind that. If they view it similarly, or they have Ivy higher, or they think they can get one of the top 3 guys because something crazy happens, then I think the Pacers might aggressively try to move up. Kevin Pritchard and his, he's talked a lot about one of his drafts with Portland, where he walked away with Brandon Roy and LaMarcus Aldridge in the same draft. He was trading like crazy that night to make that happen. If he views a guy that he wants to get, he said after, I think every GM says the same words, right? But after the latter, he said, we'll be aggressive to get our guy. No GM's like, well, we'll see what happens. But, I think that if the scenario lines up where the Kings are willing to move back and the Pacers identify a guy in that scenario that you just described, it'd probably be Ivy, but maybe it's Sharp, maybe it's Keegan, maybe it's someone else. Who knows? That they really want to go get. I think it is possible, given where these two teams are headed, for a trade to happen.
Just so you know, after the mock draft happened, or rather, I'm sorry, after the draft lottery happened, I went on to NBA 2K and made sure that the draft order was the way it was, and I was able to work out the Kings trading number 4 to the Pacers to bring Tyrese Halliburton back. So I'm just saying it's a possibility. No, there are a lot of Kings fans.
What's the funniest outcome? Like Buddy Hield goes back to Sacramento in this trade,
and they trade De'Aaron Fox somehow, and it's just an absolute disaster. But we get months of content out of it. Okay, we know that's not happening. Tyrese is comfortably an Indiana Pacer. The Kings are happy with Domantas Sabonis, although Sabonis has sped up their timeline a little bit. They have basically 2 years until Sabonis' contract runs out to win some basketball games. And there's reports that there's basically a win now, make the playoffs mandate for this upcoming season. General manager Monty McNair hasn't extended his contract yet. He's going on the last year. So it seems like the pressure is on for the Kings to make a move. So this is why trading back makes sense in the case that the Kings could potentially, in a trade back, still get a really good rookie while also getting an already established NBA talent that can help them win right away. And Tony, the conversation that I've heard, I've seen on Kings social media, I've heard on the radio airwaves here in Sacramento is Malcolm Brogdon being that piece that the Sacramento Kings would target. That's the first name I throw out there. What's the first thing that pops into your mind about the availability of Malcolm Brogdon in these kind of negotiations?
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating because, when I thought about the Pacers trading up using their vets, I look at the Kings, right? And they have Sabonis. And so some of the vets the Pacers would be considering trading would be like Miles Turner. I don't think Turner plus Sabonis is happening again in a different market.
Run it back.
Run it back, right? So that's out. Buddy Hield is out for a litany of reasons as well. And none of the rest of their vets have a lot of value except for Brogdon, right? So if for the Kings specifically, the only vet that makes sense in these discussions is Brogdon. So first of all, for the Kings and Pacers specific talks, great that if Brogdon is a piece that the Kings want, that this could happen again, and these two teams could be involved in a second big trade in the matter of, what would this be, 4 months? Because while Brogdon is good, very good, in fact, 2 things have really changed the way he's kind of viewed in the Pacers ecosystem. One is that he's been hurt a lot, and I don't think that's a secret to anyone, even in Sacramento. He's averaged less than 50 games played in his 3 seasons with the Pacers. Granted, 2 of those seasons were shortened due to COVID reasons, but that's not a lot of games. He played less than half this past season, although, again, he missed time with COVID. They sat him out for they were resting him at the end of the season down the stretch. So he probably could have played closer to like 45, I'll say. But injuries in general have kind of made him a little less valuable here. And the other thing is, even though he is fantastic, Halliburton's better. Maybe not like way better right now, but definitely will be, and was close to this season. And when those two were on the court together, Matt, Malcolm Brogdon and Tyrese Halliburton on the floor for the Pacers, 201 minutes, minus 17.3 net rating for the Pacers this season. It's only 8 games. They were learning how to play together. I'm willing to give grace for such a small sample. That's terrible. Halliburton needs the ball all the time. If the Pacers are going to be a young and growing team, inserting another guard next to him who also requires the ball at times does not make a lot of sense. So I think that maybe they could try to make it work. Those 2 guys expressed that they fit well together. The coaching staff says we think it makes sense, but it didn't. So it would make sense to me I just talked about this on Locked On Pacers this week. It would make sense to me for the Pacers to explore trades for Brogdon, especially if it's in a situation where they can also accomplish their draft night goals of being aggressive and getting the player they want. So if this truly is something that the Kings want, I think this could be a really, really good fit. Hey guys, let's take one short little break to talk about the good folks over at betonline.net, your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, news, and odds, including this year's basketball championship matchup. The finals going on right now, the NHL Hockey Conference Finals, Major League Baseball, and of course, the latest fighting news from MMA, UFC, boxing, and more. They've got lines up for Game 3 up on BetOnline.net for NBA right now. They've got, like I said, those odds for hockey and Oilers Avalanche and Rangers Lightning all on there. You got to check it out. BetOnline, your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action over at BetOnline. BetOnline is where the game starts.
Tony, in addition to the Malcolm Brogdon conversation, we also have to, from the Kings' perspective, talk about a player who some make comparisons to Brogdon in some ways that's currently a King, which is Donte DiVincenzo, another player that the Kings acquired at the trade deadline from the Milwaukee Bucks in their three-team Marvin Bagley deal. The Kings have wanted DiVincenzo for a while. He's a restricted free agent. I, at this point in time, would be shocked if DiVincenzo doesn't return unless the Kings pulled off a move like this where they acquired Brogdon and suddenly the necessity for DiVincenzo isn't as high and maybe they're not willing to pay the money that they're willing to pay right now to bring DiVincenzo back. But you've watched DiVincenzo play with him spending most of his career in the East with the Milwaukee Bucks, the Pacers, of course, being in the East. When you think about Brogdon compared to Donte DiVincenzo, are there significant differences? Is one significantly better than the other or slightly better than the other in your mind? If the Kings had to choose between the two, do you think they'd lean in any one particular direction?
Yeah, Brogdon, I think, is like a little better at DiVincenzo at everything, basically. The defensive end's the biggest separator to me. Not that DiVincenzo is like an awful defender or anything, but I would definitely not call him an overwhelming positive on the end of the floor necessarily. You could speak to that better than I could. Whereas Brogdon, especially on the ball, has really grown as a defender a lot. He gets beat by quicker guards sometimes, but a lot of players do because they're fast. So that's his biggest area for growth, I think, as a player in general, is on those speedy guards. But Brogdon's much better on defense to me. And on offense, I think Brogdon's biggest pro is that he can toggle between two roles pretty effectively. If he's asked to be the point guard and play make, he's pretty good at that. His assists per game, if he would have qualified for the leaderboards because he was hurt so much, would have ranked 16th in the league this year, I believe. That's good. That's really high. You don't think of him in that way when you think of Malcolm Brogdon, but he is a pretty good passer and really good at kind of running an offense and setting up plays. But he can also toggle that off-ball role really well. 50, 40, 90 is that off-ball guy with Milwaukee. Had a really nice shooting season with the Pacers under Nate Bjorkgren when that was the most actualized he's been when they were running a lot through Sabonis. Caris LeVert was involved in the playmaking. He shot very well from three that season. This past season, he had to take more off the dribble threes. And the first season with the Pacers when Oladipo was hurt, more off the dribble threes. But he can toggle between those two roles. So that's where I think he separates himself from Donte as well, is he can play at a high level off and on the ball, whereas DiVincenzo, I think, requires the ball a little more to be at his most effective. So I think Brogdon's the better of the two in most areas. I think I get what you're saying, that Donte could be on that path, but I don't think he'll quite ever reach Brogdon's level.
I do agree with that. And I do see, even though I'm a fan of Donte DiVincenzo, I do see Malcolm Brogdon as the immediate upgrade, assuming that he can stay healthy. Again, Donte DiVincenzo is also coming off of a pretty significant injury and has not gotten back to what he was for Milwaukee before that injury too. So we're not talking about a completely healthy guy versus a perpetually injured guy. But Brogdon, I mean, you look at his injury history, and it's not necessarily the best over the last 3 seasons: 54 games, 56 games, then just 36 games this last season. So there are definitely some concerns there. How much do you think those injury concerns drive down Brogdon's value, not just in this hypothetical trade up conversation between the Kings and the Pacers, but in general?
I think it has to, not a lot, but a pretty fair amount. I mean, you kind of always imagine, I don't know how much front offices weigh this in, but you kind of always imagine in your head when you think about the perfect actualized version of any basketball team that every player plays like 70 games or more, right? Brogdon has never done that. I think once, actually, his sophomore season or second season, he played over 70. It's just not something he's ever done, right? You have to kind of think in your head that he's going to be hurt for some portions of every season. And it's a lot of little things for him every year that pop up. And, he's the king of the most random, like, oh, he's suddenly questionable and no one has any idea why. So if it was like, one fluky muscle thing that happened over and over, maybe you think a strong rehab department could help. Or if it was a bunch of fluky things, kind of like Gordon Hayward has a lot of fluky injuries, maybe. But I just think he is a little more frail than a lot of players in his position, and that certainly has to be a negative, to me at least, in a guy's value, because you're probably only expecting 50 to 60 games from him a season.
What I like a lot about Malcolm Brogdon, we talk about the immediate impact. We also talk about the Kings needing to change their culture in so many ways. It's just been a culture of losing, a culture of piss poor defense. Davion Mitchell is trying to change that. They now hired Mike Brown, who's known as a more defensive minded head coach. So, in a lot of ways, Brogdon helps check some of those boxes, brings that dog mentality defensively. I think you'd be an excellent type of player in Mike Brown's system. I'm curious what you think about the significance that Brogdon can have impacting winning culture and assuming he stays healthy, helping bring the Kings. I'm not saying he's going to immediately vault the Kings into the playoff conversation. It's going to have to be an improvement by committee, but he's checks that box, that type of guy that the Sacramento Kings are looking for.
Yeah, the most recent season the Pacers had, despite them being awful, was Brogdon's first year where he had to be kind of the off-court leader. They didn't have Vic anymore. He was clearly at least one of their best players coming off the season before, and they had a miserable 2020-21 season, and Kevin Pritchard challenged the team after the season. He said, I need someone to step up and be a leader. We don't have that role right now, and Brogdon did it. That was something he took upon himself, and he talked about a lot, coordinating team events, including a workout in California for the Pacers last summer, locker room leader as well. That they needed someone to step into that role, and he did it. He also, super charitable guy, has his Hoops 2.0 thing going on in Africa where they install water wells every summer, is a part of the NBA Players Association. He's a vice president for that crew. Very involved community guy, super good locker room guy who's growing in that area. From a culture perspective, I know a lot of people in Indiana, especially because there's been 2 coaching changes in the last couple of seasons, have kind of questioned this team's culture. I don't think Brogdon's been totally hands off in that, but I think he's a good off-court guy in terms of the way he impacts the community and impacts the team, despite the Pacers kind of floundering in that department the last couple of years.
In our next segment, we're going to talk about the possibility of this trade and these trade talks from a Pacers perspective. So I don't want to spoil anything too much. But with the conversation in Sacramento revolving around Malcolm Brogdon and 6 for 4, the Kings would have to throw in some financial filler in order to make things work. So it definitely wouldn't be that trade verbatim set in stone. But do you think it would be absurd or asking too much of Sacramento to want additional more than likely draft compensation in addition to Brogdon? Or do you think that would be a reasonable request because of Brogdon's injury history and the jump from 6 to 4?
Not at all. I think I quite rate Brogdon, and we'll talk about what his value would be in a second when we talk about the flip side or the Pacer side here. But even if he played 60 to 70 games every year, given the history of trading up in the lottery, I think he would probably take more anyway. Not a ton more, but a little bit more. And we'll talk about a recent trade too that's kind of relevant here. So no, I think it'd be smart of the Kings to ask for more. I mean, they jumped up to 4 in a lottery that is commonly considered a 4-player draft. That's huge in terms of the value of this pick. So I think the Kings would be smart to, hang whoever over a barrel is coming to try to get number 4.
Well, let's flip the perspective coming up next, talking about these trade talks and Malcolm Brogdon potentially to Sacramento 4 and 6 swap from a Pacers perspective. That's right here on the Locked On Podcast Network.
Thanks, everybody, for making either Locked On Kings or Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. Both podcasts available and free on all platforms and YouTube, where you can see me smiling and Matt smirking, headed to a smile. There we go. Yeah, from a Pacers perspective, a trade up from 6 to 4 is really fascinating to me. And so I'm going to go back in time a little before we kind of talk about this, because the Hawks and Pelicans made a huge trade in the 2019 draft. That is not a perfect barometer, but it's a starting point for me. The Hawks had the 8th pick that year. The Pelicans had the 4th pick heading into this draft. And there were some other trades that led to these picks being acquired by these teams. The trade was the Hawks got Solomon Hill, who, let's remind everybody here, he at the time was making a ton of money and was slightly bad salary at about $13 million, but not terrible. Solomon Hill went to the Hawks. The 4th pick went to the Hawks, and the 57th pick went to the Hawks, as well as a future second rounder. So that is 4, Solomon Hill, and 2 seconds. The Pelicans got, in exchange for 4, pick 8, pick 17, pick 35, and a top 10 protected future first. So they effectively got a top 10 pick, a just outside the lottery pick, a future first, and a good second, right? And so that's from 8 to 4. So in theory, it takes less than that. But when I always look back at trades where teams traded up, it takes, even inside the top 10, it takes a lot to move up. Think about the Hawks having to give up an extra first and something else to go from 5 to 3 in the infamous Trae Young-Luka Doncic trade, for example. So I think that people really undersell what it would take for the Pacers to do this, even though it's only 2 spots. It's already something that's sort of expensive. And then you also consider that it's a draft that's largely considered a 4-player draft. So to me, the Pacers have pick 31, the best possible second rounder in this draft, for example. Maybe Brogdon's involved in this if the Kings truly want him. The Pacers also have this future first from the Cavaliers that's lottery protected next season that they could include in a trade, right? They have extra stuff to make it happen. But, I think that it's not going to be as steep as the trade we just talked about because the Pacers have 6, not 8. But I do think people kind of undersell that it would take kind of a lot, to me at least, for the Pacers to go even from 6 to 4.
Yeah, with the Kings being in the power position that moving up to 4 is, you're going to push and probably are going to start with a rebuttal or with if let's say Indiana calls Sacramento, says, "Hey, name your price." Sacramento's going to start with a price that most people would roll their eyes at, which is probably similar to that trade that you just read. It's Malcolm Brogdon and a litany of draft picks on top of that. I personally, and this is terrible negotiations on my part from the Kings perspective, I don't think Indiana has to do that much. I truly don't. At least in my mind, I don't know how many firsts and how good the firsts would have to be to really get Monte McNair to bite. But if I were Indiana, I would not move more than, God, I even hesitate in a way to say I would not move more than 2 future firsts in order to move up. But that personally, again, for me, from my perspective, if I'm Indiana, that feels like a lot to give up to move 2 spots unless one of the consensus 3 drop down. So maybe it would be easier to negotiate with me than it would for Monte McNair.
Yeah, but then the Kings are getting calls for more than just the Pacers. I mean, they probably will anyway. But if that happens, like if Ivy goes 3 or something, all of a sudden Banchero's sitting there 4, whoever it is. We're making up names, but then all of a sudden Monte McNair better have like 6 cell phones on him because it's going to be chaotic.
Well, and that's what makes the 5 minutes in between draft picks so fascinating. Like, I have a feeling that as soon as whatever happens at pick 3, really, unless OKC and Orlando go AWOL and it's not one of Chet, Paulo, or Jabari at either of those spots, really what happens with Houston from that point on, like, it's just phone calls galore for all 5-minute periods for the Kings, for the Pacers, for the Pistons, even the Portland Trailblazers. Like, I think that window of time, if we could be a fly on the wall in those draft rooms, that is where a lot of these negotiations are going to take place. You set up precursors. You have precursor conversations, like running through hypothetical scenarios, like we have done already. But until something actually happens and you either have the choice of this player or this trade in your lap that is going to happen on draft night, you hesitate to really pull the trigger. I think Sacramento, truthfully, if Sacramento could find a way to get multiple firsts and Malcolm Brogdon from the Indiana Pacers in order to just move down 2 spots, especially with potentially a guy like Keegan Murray available there, who's a great fit for this team going forward, I think they really strongly consider that. I know I sure as hell do.
So we'll keep using the Hawks. The poor Hawks, they've made so many trades inside the top 10 that I'm not piling on them. They're just a great barometer, although I do feel like they lost both of these trades in retrospect. The Luka trade, the Hawks went backwards from 3 to 5. The Mavs went up from 5 to 3. And so what that ended up being was the 5th pick and then the 10th pick the following year, which was Cam Reddish. Ignore the names who were picked because that obviously makes the Hawks look way worse. But it became 5 and then 10 the next year for 3. So, if it's 6 for the Pacers and Brogdon, is Brogdon worth the 10th pick? Maybe. I have a little lower on that's close. So I think it would take a little more than that. So maybe it's like 6 Brogdon, 31, and then the Kings even still would be right to say, well, we got a guy that we think can be awesome, and if we fall to 6, we don't think it's as awesome. So you got to throw in a little more, and then the Pacers have to consider their own first, the Cavs first. Do they have another asset that makes sense here in terms of like a young player? But I don't think they'd be willing to part with many of their young guys in this situation. So, what, like, do you think 631 Brogdon's enough, or does it depend on how the top of the draft goes? How does that feel to you?
631, and I personally, I think the Kings could probably get more given their position, but I think it is a very accurate starting point of where the conversation, maybe the lowest offer that Indiana could realistically put on the table.
I think it's the lowest offer they can make where Monty doesn't just click.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. Absolutely. And you brought up something interesting too that I think is really relevant to this conversation. As soon as a name is attached to this spot, the stock, the value plummets, right? Because a draft pick, having the 4th pick, that has potential, that has power, that has control. As soon as you attach Jaden Ivey or Keegan Murray or Shaden Sharp to that, even if the name is exciting and has all the potential and upside on the planet, it's like driving a new car off of a car lot. It instantly drops down in value. So that's why these conversations before the selections are made sometimes results in a team like the Hawks giving up too much or not accepting enough in order to move down. It just makes the conversation so much interesting. So
Atlanta got Trae Young, who's like all NBA level every year, and I'm like, oh, these idiots, what were they thinking in these 2 trades? Like they clearly did something right, even though maybe the value wasn't great.
Never mind what the Kings did it too. Never mind what the Kings did it too. Yeah, the
I was
Hawks were
trying
idiots.
to not talk about that. I was going out of my way to avoid that. So yeah, I agree with you that would not be enough, the offer that I have just described. And the problem with what I just said too is the teams would have to send back salary to the Pacers if Brogdon is involved, and then it gets even more complicated. Like we talked about Solomon Hill being negative money earlier. Do the Kings have a guy they view as negative money? I don't know. There's a lot of other stuff involved. There's also a Cavs first here that I think could be pretty interesting as a value piece because they were so close for that pick going to the Pacers as 15 or 16. If it's close to that good again next year, and the Cavs look like they'll get better, they have Evan Mobley and Darius Garland. But, that could be a valuable thing as well. That could potentially be a swing piece. But I think it will take more than people realize to get from 6 to 4, as you just detailed. Like, let's pretend Brogdon is worth, a late lotto pick or an early outside the lotto pick, something like 12 to 16 straight up. Even that is not quite what the Hawks got for going from 5 to 3, right? So, or inverse, 3 to 5. So it still would take more there. So I think that people kind of have to think about, if the Pacers have a lot of extra exciting assets right now because of how they position themselves this season, but it might take like almost all of them to get from 6 to 4. And yet me, the guy who's never seen the Pacers pick inside the top 10 ever, in my whole life, they've never picked lower than 10. I would still probably do it. This is your best chance at that blue chip guy ever. This in the market. These teams can't sign studs. They got to draft them. And that maybe what that the Kings got Fox. He was definitely a stud 2 years ago, right? Like they did it. Maybe Halliburton's that guy for the Pacers, TBD. But if you're the Pacers and let's pretend they don't. This happens again. They have another run of amazing success, and they don't pick inside the top 10 for another 33 years. Would you don't want to look back and go, we held on. Well, we held on to the Cavs first. Who's going to care if it doesn't lead to anything? So if I'm the Pacers, would be very, very aggressive and willing to include a lot of those extra things I acquired to move up, even if it does seem expensive, because they don't have these opportunities very often.
Well, 2 things that I want to bring up. Number one, from the Kings' perspective, too, I think a lot of this conversation where we can't figure it out and we can only purely speculate is the Kings have to be pretty confident that a guy that they want is going to be there at 6. So if it's
Agreed.
me, right, and if we're doing our ultimate mock draft on the Locked On NBA channel, which we're doing very, very shortly.
Matt, I'm getting a call. It's Troy Weaver. He said he's not telling us who he's picking at 5.
Damn it.
We're in trouble.
See, that's the hard part, right? Because if I'm Sacramento, for me personally, I love the idea of Keegan Murray. I think he checks so many boxes for what the Kings need. He's the closest thing as a rookie to a win now type player that you could hope for. Of course, we haven't seen him play a single second in the NBA yet. So if you could tell me that I could pull off a deal like this, get multiple firsts, Malcolm Brogdon and Keegan Murray would definitely be available at 6. I am so much more willing to say yes to that than I am currently, because what if the Detroit Pistons take Keegan Murray at 5 and shatter my soul? Because Shaden Sharp is still available there, and taking Sharp at 6 is a little bit less of a risk, I guess, because you got Brogdon out of it than taking him at 4. But I have so many concerns with the mystery that is Shaden Sharp that I'm terrified about it. Maybe AJ Griffin is the pick there. Not as nearly exciting, in my opinion, as like a Keegan Murray or a Jaden Ivey is. So a lot of who the Kings want, and if they think that guy's going to be available at 6, plays into this conversation. The last thing that I want to ask you, Tony, is what is the max offer you think realistically, like the highest the Pacers go before they start hanging up the phone in any kind of 4 or 6 trade?
Yeah, like I think, because I was about to say, like, okay, let's go 6, 31, include all the Pacers picks this year, 58, the Cavs first as well. Brogdon's in there. Okay, on the King side, whatever. Let's like Harkless and Holmes. Do you care about that? That's money.
Expiring contracts.
We did it. Okay, great. We did it. That After that, I think you got to stop and think, okay, we're willing to give up another one of our firsts, because if you're the Pacers, you just want 25 games. You got to be very careful with your firsts in short-term seasons, but maybe one like 2025 or something. You got to be careful because of Stepien. That's where it gets close, because then it's 6, 2 extra firsts, and 31, and a good vet. So I think that I would not quite do that, although I would definitely have to think very hard about it given their situation, because again, they don't pick this high very often. So that's the fake trade. Let's run with that. 6, the Cavaliers 2023 first round pick. 31, 58, Malcolm Brogdon for 4, Rashawn Holmes and Mo Harkless. I believe that's legal.
Let's put it this way. I think the Sacramento Kings would strongly consider it. There might be some hesitation with Rashawn Holmes, even though the money is necessary. Rashawn does still have some positive value there, and the Kings don't necessarily want to throw him away when they have other expiring contracts.
What if the Pacers throw in the 18th pick from 2018? It's Goga Batadze.
Now we're talking. Now
you guys saw get in a spat against the Kings with an assistant coach. I actually forgot that was against the Kings. His value is probably not a ton positive, but I think it's probably a little bit positive. So yeah, I think the Pacers would be willing to include him too, because they have Turner and Isaiah Jackson on the team already.
Yeah, there's where the next part of the negotiation goes. It sounds like what we're getting out here is, once again, the Pacers and Kings could be very legitimate trade partners on draft night. There are a lot of outliers that can only happen on draft night for a trade to be in place, but it would not surprise me at all, Tony, if there are precursors in place between these two teams that are visited when the Kings are on the clock at 4.
100% agreed, and I think that a lot of people would be surprised at the value on the Pacers' end, but that's what it takes. And the Kings have earned it thanks to the ping pong balls.
We'll take it. We'll take the luck. Let's not screw it up this time.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to Locked On Pacers and Locked On Kings, and making whichever one you're listening to first, your first listen today and every single day. We both advise, by the way, since we're both covering the draft so often, Locked On NBA Big Board as a place that you go listen to, because those guys are covering the draft every day. They go to workouts and interview players. It's crazy. Those dudes know more about the draft than I know about some of my family members. Everybody, thank you a ton for listening. Have a great day, and we will both see you tomorrow.